Hello, everyone. So I was hoping a few more people would show up, so I waited a little bit to start the webinar, but it seems as if we have all that we're going to have. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start first by explaining how this webinar is going to work. So basically, what's going to happen is I'm going to walk through the material for this webinar, which today is queries and reports. Unlike most other webinars, I don't really have a handout for this one because everything that we will go over has been written in the admin manual. I did leave copies of the admin and basic users manual in the handout section. So you should see that, and that should be available to you. So those will be the material largely that I will be working with today. And I will be stopping intermittently for to give attendees the chance to ask questions. So if I stop and ask for questions, you're muted, obviously. I can't hear you, so you have to show me that you have a question either by raising your hand, which you can do in the GoToWebinar interface, or going to the questions panel on the GoToWebinar interface and asking a question there. So you can do that either way, and I will either unmute you or read your question and try to answer it for you. So those are sort of the two ways that we have to be able to communicate with each other. You can raise your hand or you can ask me a question. You can do that anytime, and if I see it, I'll make sure I get to it, but I will be stopping at specific points to answer any related questions specifically. So I don't have a PowerPoint or any materials, as I mentioned before, so I think we're just going to go ahead and dive in. So this is about queries and reports and outcome tracker. And the nice thing about creating queries and reports and outcome tracker is that it's a very forgiving process. I like to say it's a very forgiving process. There's very little that you can do in the process of creating a query or a report that will do any sort of damage to your database or to your data. I would like to say there's nothing you could do, but sometimes people surprise me. But I've yet to see anything. The worst usually that will happen is that the query or report that you're working on will stop running. And that only affects that query and report, doesn't affect anything. It doesn't affect anything else. So you should be fine to be pretty liberal in playing with queries and reports. There's very, very little risk of doing any sort of damage. Like you can't accidentally delete records, and you can't really do anything negative. So that's a great playing field for what to be on, so that you know that you can be pretty open with playing with queries and reports and trying to figure out how to make them work. So what is a query and what is a report? So I like to think of it like a house. The query is the foundation, and the report is the actual house. So before you can make your house, you have to lay your foundation. So that's what the query is. And then the report you build on top of that. So you always create a query first, unless of course the query that you need is already made, then you can go ahead and make your report. But the query almost always comes first. And a query pulls the information together. So anything that you want to know in your database, you will pull a query to get to that information. And a report will display that information in more meaningful ways, which we will talk about a little bit later. So that's basically what the difference between a query and report is, and a little bit of a definition of each. So I think let's dive into creating a query. So let's say I want to know how many people were admitted in a specific date range. It looks like we have a question from Samantha. So what I'm going to do is unmute Samantha so that she can ask her question. Hi, Samantha, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. Am I supposed to be able to see a screen because I can't see anything? I didn't know if your screen shared or...
Thank you very much for catching that, because I did not.
Okay. I was waiting and nothing was happening. Okay, that's all I needed.
Thanks. I haven't gone over anything that you necessarily needed to see my screen for yet. So thank you for catching that at that time, because it's a good time to catch it. So let's say I want to create a query and I want to know how many people were admitted within a particular date range. That's just all I want to know. So I'm going to create a query. I'm just going to call it people, or more accurately, clients admitted within a date range. One thing I will say is sort of a best practice I've learned over the years of working with Outcome Tracker is that it is best to be pretty specific with your title and your description. If at all possible, you want to be pretty specific about what you're trying to do, because as you build queries and reports, you'll probably build multiple queries and reports. You might build closely related queries and reports that get at almost the same thing, but not quite. So when it comes time to pull queries and reports, you'll want to be able to see what exactly you need to pull. So for instance, in this folder here, we see that this is the title and this is the description. These could be labeled a little bit better, but they're clear what each of them are meant to accomplish. So it is best to be quite clear in your title and description. So I'm pulling from intake to get number of clients admitted. Okay. So another thing that I will say is sort of a best practice for both queries and reports, when you are creating your queries and reports, it's probably best to store them in your personal folder, which it defaults to when you create your query and report. So all you have to do is not change the default. And the reason why it's best to store it in your personal folder at first is if you start putting your queries and reports in public folders, it can become quite confusing about what is meant to be what, and especially if you're creating a query and you're playing around with it and you have to walk away from it. If it's in a public folder, somebody might try to pull it, not understand that the numbers that they're looking at, because you're not quite done making your query or report. So until you run the report, verify that it works correctly and that the numbers reflect what they meant to reflect, and that the title and description appear to be clear about what the report or query is accomplishing, I would save them in your personal folder and then move them to a public folder if they need to be moved at all. So I'm going to save this to my personal folder. I'm going to click next. So a query you will want to pull in every field that you think that you might need in your report if you're going to create a report after. So it doesn't usually hurt unless it's a lot of fields. It doesn't usually hurt to pull in more fields than you need into a query. So I would err on the side of being pretty liberal in what fields you pull into your query, because you can always just not put them in the report if you're going to create a report after. So you always just kind of want to make sure that you have all of the fields that you need in the query. And what I usually do is just add all the fields from the activity that I'm pulling. So I'll go over that in just a moment. But before I get there, I want to explain the defaults. By default, when you create a query, you will always have these two selected. So when you create a query, this interface will have 3 columns. This group, this group here in the middle, and this group to the right. On the left, we have all the fields that are in the database. In the middle, we have all the fields that are a part of the group that we're currently selected, which I will explain in just a moment. And on the far right, we have all the columns that are going to be a part of my query. And by default, whenever you start a query, it starts you with full name and system ID. And so you will almost always want these a part of your query, so leave them in there. So by default, you'll have these two already in there. And then in my example, I want a basic query on the intake. So I'm going to go to details. Whenever you're creating a basic query just to pull information from a certain activity on Outcome Tracker, this is the path that you will take. And that is most of the reports and queries that you will make in Outcome Tracker. So on the far left here, under all enrollments, we go to details. And we will want enrollment activity description. Enrollment begin date you often want, but not always. I'm going to add it anyway because, like I said, it doesn't hurt to have a field in your query that you aren't going to actually need. Enrollment provider will probably want. So enrollment activity description is the name of the activity that we're pulling information from. Enrollment begin date is usually the date of the activity, but the admission intake form is a special case in that it has a separate admission date. So that's what we'll actually be pulling from when we make this query. So it's good to keep in mind, enrollment begin date is typically what you would use for an activity, but the admission intake form activity, which is honestly the one that you'll probably be pulling from the most, is a special case and doesn't actually use this form. An enrollment provider is a list of staff in your database. I don't think it's necessarily prudent to the intake, but as I said, it might be, and it doesn't hurt to add it. I almost always add these 3 out of habit because I have found that I often need them even if I think I don't, and it doesn't hurt to add them to have more than you need. So you almost always want enrollment activity description, enrollment begin date, and enrollment provider. So now once we grab those 3, we might want more. We might want enrollment hours. If it's something like counseling sessions, enrollment hours might be good because that's usually where you track like how long the session lasts, how long an activity lasts. We might want to add that. We might want to add enrollment link ID. And if we want to do that, we would show all down here. So the difference here is that when you in any group over here, it will only show you what's common. So if you want something like enrollment link, you have to show all and see there's quite a few more fields here, but that's how you would add enrollment link if you wanted it. So we have our 3, just for now, I'll stick to the 3 basic ones. And now we're ready to pull in questions from our activity. So what we do is after we go to all enrollments detail, we go to questions show by activity. Then we want repeatable activities. This is where almost everything you will want to pull will come from, repeatable activities. And then admission intake form for our case. I just want everything. I'm just going to pull everything. So how I do that is I just select one, press Control A, and then move them over. So I am pulling everything in the database from this activity, from the admission intake form. Every question on there, I'm pulling into the query. So you'll see these are all your activities, all the activities that are set up in your database. So if you wanted, for instance, instead of something from the admission intake form, you'd go to, maybe you want goal attainment, you go here, we see all the goal attainment questions. If you want occupancy, go here, all the occupancy questions. So that is how you add questions to the query. Okay. One thing I will say now is that Outcome Tracker is, while building queries and reports is a forgiving process, as I said earlier, it can be a finicky process as well. So one thing that I have noticed is that you can't pull questions from the same activity in different places. So for instance, if I go to questions show all, it shows all of the questions in the database. And if I try to pull in a question from the intake form from here into here, it's not compatible with all the other questions from the intake form, which I pulled from going questions show by activity, admission intake form, activity questions. So it's easier to go enrollments, questions by activity, find your activity, and then pull in the questions. Another way you could do it is to go by enrollments by activity advanced, and you'll see a similar thing. There's our admission intake form. But if I add the questions from here, these questions are not compatible with the other area in which I pulled questions. And the reason for that is that these serve a slightly different purpose than the questions in all enrollments show by activity, repeatable activities. These two groups serve a slightly different purpose, and I won't get into it what the difference is, because I don't think it's useful for you right now. But just so you know, you will have to pull all your questions from the same place. Okay. The other thing is that you can't really pull questions from the same activity. Sorry, you can't really pull questions from two different activities into the same query. For that, you will need a subquery, and I'm actually going to be giving a webinar about that on a week from today. So I would say that you should probably it's taking a long time. Here we go. The sort order is fine. You can change the setting. I usually don't need to. What it is by default is fine. Now we come to adding filters. You'll almost always want to add at least 3 filters. One for enrollment activity description, and it'll almost always be enrollment activity description equals the activity that we want, which in this case is admission intake form. So basically what we're telling Outcome Tracker is that we're only interested, I didn't mean to finish, but this is a good example of how it's a forgiving process. So let's go to filter here. What we're telling Outcome Tracker is that we're only interested in We're only interested in entries in the database in this activity, as opposed to other ones. Okay, so that's our first filter. Our second and third filter will be on the same field, and that is, in this case, admission date. Now, normally if it were something like danger assessment or goal attainment or some other activity, we would probably want to add these filters onto enrollment begin date, and they're the same filters, they're just on different fields. But because this is the admission intake form and it's a special case, we want admission date. Here we go, admission date. So I like to think of the filters that you put on dates as bookends. So the first bookend we want to be greater than or equal to. It's taking a while to load. While that's doing that, why don't I ask if there are any questions? Are there any questions? If anybody has a question, they can just sort of pop it in or raise their hand. All right, so we have our prompt here. We have the admission date greater than or equal to. We can just put a date here, we can just put a date here if we want, 01/01/2019, let's say. And what we're saying is that we want any entry in the database which has the enrollment activity description of admission intake form, and an admission date that is on or after January 1st, 2019. And that's fine. Normally, what we would do instead of that is do a prompt, so that when you run the query, you can enter any date you want at the beginning. So I'm going to create a new prompted field. I see that I do have a question from Maribel Cinco, who asks, if I want to add another question, which is not in the database, how will I do that? Okay, so in order to effectively I'm just going to click finish on that, and that will add that filter, and then I'm going to address Maribel's question. So in order to effectively pull a question into a query or report, you have to have it in your database, and you have to have been filling it out regularly. And in order to do that, you have to add the question in setup, or to the activity by going to the activity list. So for instance, if you wanted to add a question for the admission intake form, you go to the activity list, questions, and then add a question. And now once you add a question, you have to then add it to the form. But once you add a question, it will be available in that list of questions that we were looking at earlier from the admission intake form to add to the query. So that's how you would do that. If you have any questions about that, Maribel, I would contact OT support at acws.ca, and we can go over that in more detail. but that is how you would add a question to the database, so that you can add it to a form, so that you can add it to a query. It's sort of layer upon layer there. Okay, so we have our first admission date filter. So now we want to add another filter on the admission date. So let's go ahead and do that. Here it is, admission date. This time we want it less than or equal to. So like I was saying earlier, it's kind of like bookmarks. We want it to be greater than or equal to, and then less than and equal to. And we're asking Outcome Tracker to fetch any result in between these two. And it's taking a while to upload. Here we go. We want another prompt. So you'll see that the first prompt we created is in here. We want to create a new one. It's taking a while to load. Sorry about the lag. There seems to be a bit of a lag. Here we go. So where the first one was report start date, we want this to be report end date. And these aren't like necessarily, this doesn't have to be report start date. It could be start date, it could be begin date, and the other one can be end date or stop date, whatever works for you, so long as they're distinct and you're able to tell the difference between the two. I'm going to click finish. So these are the three filters that you typically want. A filter on enrollment activity description, on admission intake form, or whatever activity that you're pulling from, and two on the admission date or the enrollment begin date, greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. So that's sort of, these three are sort of the trifecta. After that, you might want to add other filters, like if maybe we're only interested in results of where a interpreter or translator was required, then we could add that. And that will pull us only results with in which a interpreter or translator was required. I don't really want that, so I'm going to delete that. So let's look here. This is a setting that you don't have to worry about. I'm just setting this so that it works a little faster, so we can go to results. And I can show you what a query looks like once you get the results that you need. So because we have a lot of fields, the prompts are a little bit closer to the center here, but the center is way off because we added a lot of fields. So I'm just going to put a report date for the beginning of the year. So we're basically saying we want anything from the beginning of the year until today. And so we see we have 5 results. Now, if I have a filter on, let's say in that example, I just want to know the number of people who have needed a translator or interpreter. And I put that on there. I suspect it's going to be 0 when I go to results, but I'm not for certain. So I'm going to go back to results. And I was right, it's 0, which I can tell no rows found. So that might be all I need to know, in which case I'm done. I don't really need to make a report, and this is something that I think is helpful for you to know, is if you just want to know the number of people in a particular thing, and just one bit of information that you need, often a query will do the trick. You don't need to make a report after that. So if I just need to know how many times we've needed an interpreter or translator in the last couple years, I could run this query and put those date range in, like, let's say maybe January 2018, and then press go. And I see there hasn't been any. In the ACWS database, there's likely some in your database, but in the ACWS database, there hasn't been any. So what that means is that I'm done. I don't really need to know anything more. So often, if you just need to know one bit of information, a datum, as we say, then excuse me, then that is likely all you will need is the query. That's basically how you make a query. I know that's a lot of information to pass on to you, but that is a simple query, and I'm going to pause now and ask if there are any questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, or you can ask it on the questions panel, and then I will get to your question. But I'm going to take a little pause here. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any more questions. Oh, there is a question. I spoke too soon. Will this training be available on the ACWS website? I'm not sure if it will go up on the ACWS website, but what I do after each webinar is we upload it to YouTube. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be uploaded to YouTube. And I will send out a link to all the people that we have in our system as outcome tracker administrators with a link to the video on YouTube, which I will probably do either tomorrow or Friday. It does take some time to upload onto YouTube, so I have to make sure I budget some time to do it. So I'll probably do that either tomorrow or Friday, send out the email, and then the OT admins, they can disseminate to their staff as they see fit. But this will be in the in a video on YouTube and disseminated to the OT admins. And then also all this information is in the admin manual too. So you should have access to that. It should be in the handout section here. And then you should also have access to that. So good question. This material will be available to all OT admins soon. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. Let's say I want to know a couple things about our intake forms at the same time. Let's say I want to know from the beginning of the year to now how many times we've needed an interpreter and translator, and also let's say I wanted to know, I'm just doing this so I can look at the fields. I've also wanted to know how many times how many times, well, let's say I also want to know the gender. Let's do that. So because it's a little bit more complicated, there's a little bit more data that I need from the same report, from the same activity, I will think to myself, better to create a query and then a report rather than just rely on a query. So in that case, I want to go to reports. Creating a report is a little bit easier than creating a query. So in the upper right-hand corner here where we went to add new query, now we just want to go to add new report. This also saves to your personal folder. I think it's a good idea to keep it in your personal folder. So I'm just going to go admission intake form. And then in the description, I'm going to be precise about what I'm looking for. Pulling new clients within date range and to see how many needed an interpreter and gender. Okay, so this is going to my personal folder. That's what I want. A CrossType report is almost always what you'll pull. I wouldn't change this. I wouldn't change this setting. I wouldn't change this setting. Let's go to next. You can name the module. This is really only useful if you're putting multiple modules in the same report. That's a little bit more complicated than what we're going for right now. I'm going to just leave this blank, which you can do. I would recommend that. Leave it blank. And now we select the query. So remember how I said the query was like the foundation and the report's like the house. So this is essentially like selecting the foundation. So we remember that we saved our query in the personal folder. And let's see, I have a lot of things in my personal folder. I need to clean it up. Let's see if I can find it. It was a admission intake form, wasn't it? This is why we should be careful. Learning. Okay. I don't remember the name of the query that we just created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to reports. Go to my personal folder. It's already on my personal folder. I'm going to sort by date modified so that the most recent client submitted within a date range. That's the query I'm looking for. Okay. Client submitted within a date range. There we go. So a CrossType report basically means that you're looking to put something along the top and something along the bottom and display the information relevant to those two things together. When I'm just looking for straight information about how many people are doing a particular thing within an activity, I usually just use enrollment activity description along the top here. So you'll see there's some cells along the top and all cells along the side. We're right now deciding what we want to display along the top. I usually just use enrollment activity description because it's the same for everybody. So that's something that you can do. If you want to do it a different way, that's definitely something that you can play around with. Like I said, it's a forgiving process. You can always change the setting, and I can show you how to do that. Now we're deciding what we want to display along the side. This is the actual information that we want to display. So we know we want is interpreter translator required, and probably let's say we want to also know they're not in alphabetical order, which makes it a little bit more difficult, especially in a field like especially in an activity like admission intake form, which has a lot of questions, many of which aren't on the forms because this has evolved so much over the years. Let's just say we want to know their favorite animals, which is something that is definitely not on the the form. So it's going to be 0. It's going to be blank. But so we want to know the favorite animals and what was the other one? Interpreter required. So to select more than one field, I'm sure you know, you select the first one, you press Control, and then you select the second one. And then you press Control, select the third, the fourth, and so on and so forth. If you want to do a number in a row, you could do these. You can do it like that. You can press Control Shift and then select multiple ones. But in general, Control and Select will help you select multiple fields at once that aren't necessarily in a row. Let's say we also want to know length of time in Canada. Okay, let's go to next. This is just shows you basically a summary of what we're doing. Cross tab from the query clients admitted within a date range. This is the what we've set up to show along the top, what we set up to show along the side, and the position, which is only important if you have multiple modules. Let's click finish. There we go. Okay, so we have our report all made. Let's take a look at it. One thing that I wish Outcome Tracker would change is when you create a report and it runs the report after you've initially created it, it defaults to go to the Edit tab. I don't think that's very useful. I wish it went to the View tab first so that you could actually look at it before you go start thinking about editing it. And you'll see that the prompts that we put in the query show up in the report now. That's always the case. Any prompt that you put into a query will show up for the report. So let's say we want January 1st from today. And now we see we have 5 people who have been input from January 1st to today. We see what their responses to all these questions were. So that's how you make a basic report. There are some other things that we can change. I'll get into some of the more useful ways to edit your report. But first I'm going to stop and ask if there are any questions. Was it clear how to make a query? Was it clear how to make a report? Was it clear the types of fields that you usually want in your queries and reports and for what reasons? If you have any questions about any of that, please raise your hand or type it out in the questions field. Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any questions, so I'm going to move on. Let's go to the Edit tab here. There are some ways in which it might be useful for you to edit these. For instance, let's say if I go back to the View tab just for a second, we see that there's been one person who's been in Canada for less than 1 year and one between 2 and 3 years, and 3 people did not answer this question. I can do this math pretty easily in my head. I know that 1 out of 5 is 20%, so I know that's 20, 20, and 60%. But let's just say there's a lot of numbers and it wouldn't be so easy to do that math in my head, and I want to know percentages as well as numbers. That's something you can do in the Edit tab. So let's go there. This is something I do quite often, so it's quite useful. So I want to walk you through how to do that. So we find the field that we're interested in, client. If client was not born in Canada, length of time in Canada, let's go to edit cell for that one. And now we see that we have the count, which is already in there, which was the 1, 1, and 3. Now we want percent of column count. We add that. And I also like to change the labels from like number of clients to and percent of clients. Update that. And close. And now the report will refresh. And we'll see it has number and percent of clients. Let's take a look at it. And now we see we have 1, 1, and 3, 20, 20, and 60%, and 5, which is 100% of the responses. So that's how you would do that. Let's say we're interested in only the people who responded to this question. So out of the people who actually responded to the question who didn't put none, we only want to know that. That's something you would do in edit too. So let's go to edit. Let's find that field. And this time we don't click edit cell. This time we actually click on the question. And where it says ignore nulls, we want to put yes in both of these. So basically what we're saying is anytime there's a null or a none, don't count it. And click update and close. And now let's go back to look at it. And now we see that it's taken out those 3 and it's factoring the percentage based out of those the remaining 2 responses. So that is one thing that is very useful. So you can add percentages into the report and you can take out any nones if you want to. And then another thing is I don't have anything that you might count. So I'm going to add a field to the vertical headers. So this is a good example of how you can edit the report. Let's say I create the report and I realize, oh, there's something else that I want to display in this report. It's just as simple as going to edit, then edit module, and then adding a vertical header. So let's say I want to add I want something I can count. So maybe let's add partner's debt amount. I don't think anybody's actually filled this out, but let's just put it in there. And so we've added that, and it shows up at the bottom here. Now, one thing that's quite useful in reports is when it's a numeric field like enrollment hours, or in this case, partner's debt amount, you can sum it instead of adding it. So for example, if I go to view now, it just says 5. What might be useful, actually, I'm not gonna, it says 5. So if what I want is to display the summed amount, I'll go up here, back to edit, back to edit cell. And then instead of percent column count like we added before to add percentages, we want sum. We add that. Now, there's a little bit more we have to do with this one because because you can sum on any field. So these are all the number fields that we could sum on if we wanted to. But what we want to sum on is partner's debt amount. So you just have to make sure that this matches what you're actually summing on. And then click update, close. If we go back to view, it'll say 0 because nobody's actually filled this out. But if people had filled this out, let's say there is one for 10,000 and another for 15,000, this would say $25,000. So it's just useful to sum some of the fields in Outcome Tracker. Okay. So those are some. So that's how you create a report. Those are some of the more useful settings that you can change in a report to make sure that your report matches what you want to pull. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to run over really quick the reporting process for Outcome Tracker, and then I'll ask if there are any questions, and then we can part ways. Okay, so just in case you aren't aware, there is a reporting procedure for Outcome Tracker. You may never need to create a report in or query. You may never need to create a query in report in Outcome Tracker because ACWS does try very hard to anticipate your needs and create your queries and reports for you. However, of course, we can't always do that. So that's why it's useful for you to know how to make queries and reports. But most of the queries and reports you will need are probably already created. So if we go to the ACWS network, shared network reports, we see that there are a lot of folders in here, and each of these folders holds queries. I wanted to talk about how you submit your data to the government, your government contact, and how you submit it to ACWS. So as a shelter, you submit your data to government contact, and occasionally ACWS will do a roundup of statistics across the whole network in our quarterly and then annual stats. So the quarterly and annual stats are pretty easy. I'll walk through that first. So basically, ACWS will send out so we see if we go to queries and reports for submitting data to external partners, we see the ACWS aggregate stats quarterly and annual. ACWS will send out a communication to its members saying we're getting ready to pull quarterly stats. If you could take a look at your data, verify that it's correct, and then we'll pull by this date, and then after that date we'll pull our data. So basically what you do, excuse me, basically what you do when you get that communication is you'll come into here, ACWS aggregate stats. In this case, let's look at the annual stats reports. Let's say you're an emergency shelter. You'll run these reports. Take a look at the information, verify that it's correct, make any corrections that you need to make. That's pretty simple. ACWS does try to make that reporting process as simple as possible. But there is also the governmental reporting process, which I think is also fairly simple. But to do that, I want to walk through that as well. So to do that, you want to go to back to that queries and reports for submitting data to external partners. And now we see that we want the provincial government reports. So we click that. And then we have the audit reports. Let's click that. And then we have emergency outreach or second stage. Let's click emergency, just for sake of example. So we have all these reports in here. What we'll want to do, similar to the ACWS quarterly stats, or annual stats is run these queries, reports, verify the information, make sure it's all correct. And then once that's done, we want to go back to the provincial government reports folder and then go to export reports, emergency residential, run that, and then export it and send that to your government contact. So I'm not going to run this report because it's pretty bulky and it takes forever to run, but I'll run a different report. I'll run that report that we just created. And I'll show you how to export queries. So this is the report that we just created. I click on it, I run it. It's taking a moment, despite the fact that it's a very simple query. Okay, so I ran it. So now I want to export the queries. And it will export the query, and then I would send that to my government contact if I were in the shelter. And that setting is just right there at the upper right-hand corner. Okay, so that I just wanted to run over the processes for reporting to the government and to ACWS while we were talking about queries and reports. So are there any questions before we wrap things up? I will give people a moment to ask any questions. And while you're asking questions, raising your hands, typing out your questions, I want to let everyone know that when you leave or when the webinar is ended, there will be a simple, I think it's 5-question survey. If you could answer that as on your way out, that would be really helpful for us. Let us know if this has been helpful and ways in which we can improve. That would be quite nice. Okay. I see that Sally has a question, so I'm going to unmute Sally so that she can ask her question. So Sally, are you there?
I just had a quick question about the exports.
Sure.
It used to be that I used to be able to pick where I wanted to save it. I can't do that anymore. I have to go into the downloads, then copy it and paste it. And
okay. Have you recently changed which browser that you're using to export?
no, Firefox, and oh wait, Firefox. So
okay.
when I go to download it, it just says okay, and it goes to the download folder, and it doesn't give me the option to choose where I want to save it.
So there's probably a setting with your browser which we can go over. If you want to email OT support at acws.ca, we can schedule a time to look that over.
Perfect, because it's inconvenient this way, that's all.
Yeah, for certain. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
It looks like we have another question. Oh, never mind. That was not a question. All right, so I think we're done. There's no other questions. Nobody else has raised their hand. So excellent. Thank you for partaking in this webinar. And if you can fill out that survey on your way out, that would be really helpful. And I hope to see you guys next week for the subqueries report. Sorry, the subqueries webinar that I plan on giving next week. So hopefully we will see you there. Bye.